All right, everybody. Welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, bias, disparate impact, and good governance. Luckily today, we're going to have somebody else talking with me as opposed to just me talking about the same topic, which has been New York City pretty much for probably 9 out of 10 of these webinars. And so today I have Merve Hickok, who's if you are on LinkedIn or Twitter, you definitely know about her work because just one of the big sort of voices in this field around AI governance, AI policy, AI ethics, and also with a huge amount of experience in HR and people management. So Merve, thank you so much for jumping on at very short notice to chat with me.
No, always a pleasure. I wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, that's great. So I think the best thing to do would first to sort of introduce, like, you are doing so many things. I have a hard time keeping track of the number of hats that you wear. So can you give us sort of just a bit of the laundry list of what you've been up to recently?
Certainly. I'm certainly keeping myself busy. So as you know, I'm the founder of AIethicist.org, and I started that to provide some research, curated research, up-to-date reports and research on AI ethics, AI policy, and governance. And over the years, that organically turned into consulting and training as well. So I work with public and private organizations on capacity building training on AI ethics, responsible AI, AI governance, and also do consulting and advisory. So it really depends on where the organization is in their responsible AI journey or in their maturity. I'm also the research director, chair, and research director at Center for AI and Digital Policy. So with the center, we have an extensive AI policy education, advocacy, and advising work. And we have grown enormously over the last 2 years, which has been great to be involved in this work. And what we do with the center is look at, so our mission is based on fundamental rights, rule of law, and democratic values, and how those are impacted with AI and digital policies. So we want to make sure that anything that comes with AI policy and regulations have those fundamental rights and democratic values at the core, which means that we have to identify certain policy frameworks around the world which have big impact, such as EU AI Act, Council of Europe AI Convention work right now, UNESCO recommendations, OECD AI guidelines, just to name a few. So we're looking at how to enhance these frameworks. And on the other hand, we always come back to capacity building and training, right? We need more people to be engaged in this conversation, more inclusive conversations. So we try to educate AI policy advocates, researchers, and practitioners with the center. So that takes up a lot of my work, and I shift a significant amount of time kind of focusing on that right now. And then the third hat, and I'm going to stop there, is with University of Michigan. I'm one of the lecturers in the data science ethics program at the Masters of Applied Data Science program. So with the masters, we have students from all over the world, actual practitioners of data science. So I get to interact with those students on the ethics of data science. What does that mean? And because they're from all over the world, we also get to engage in more multicultural conversations of how do you, what's your perspective on such and such principle, how to go about this, etc. So across those three hats, it gives me a lot of room to research, engage in the conversations, and then also turn around and with my clients or with the students to kind of work on the operational side of things.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of, so I'm interested in the policy stuff a lot, but not so much policy per se, but how policy gets operationalized. Like so we're seeing so many regulations now being proposed. So the U.S. has a ton. At the local, like city level, up to the state level, and then even some federal regulations like the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which sort of is kind of dead in the water now, it seems. But the EU now is really pushing for regulating AI and being the leaders, right? Like they did with GDPR. But what are the key things? Like, where are we at with this? Like there seems to be like, there's the Digital Services Act, which is regulating big platforms, and there's going to have some auditing stuff associated with that. And then there's the AI Act itself. Where does Europe sit now? Like, where are we at in terms of these regulations, and what do you think are kind of the key things they got to get right in order to really be effective?
Let me start with the second part and kind of take us back to the objectives of the EU AI Act, or the draft first. So if you go back to 2018, where 2018-20 timeframe, you had the high-level expert group in EU who have gone through and published the trustworthy AI guidelines. And they had some recommendations, and those recommendations combined with EU's digital future strategies. Those are combined into, or now opening up a number of different drafts, right? Legislative proposals. EU AI Act is one, as you mentioned. AI Liability Act, the PSA, the MA, the Data Act, which is all together separate. So these are all coming out of the those initial conversations of where EU wants to be and how they want to regulate. So you're looking at them building on top of each other.
Yeah.
In particular, for the EU AI Act, the idea was to, like, it had two stated objectives. One, to harmonize the EU market, so individual countries were not coming up with different levels of regulations, sometimes conflicting regulations. So they wanted to harmonize that. And then the second was to protect rights and health and safety of the people in EU, of individuals in EU, as per the Charter. What I've been saying since the beginning is the Act is more leaning towards the first objective in terms of innovation, harmonization, and technical stuff, and not so strong on the protection of fundamental rights and rule of law. And it's hard to balance, not hard balance, but it's hard to get both right in a single act, right? So I think there's a lot of work to do in the EU AI Act to kind of increase the level of safeguards to make it more aligned with that second objective of fundamental rights. But we also are keeping an eye on the Council of Europe, which is a totally separate body, and what they're doing with the AI Convention, because their mandate is fully protection of fundamental rights, rule of law, and democratic values. Coming back to the EU AI Act right now, where we are at is 2021, April 2021, Commission made the first proposal. Since then, the EU presidencies, which change every 6 months, have been making some changes to the proposal. A few weeks ago in December, beginning of December, the Council of the European Union, which was under the Czech presidency, they finalized their general approach, and it has been approved by the Council. So they have published that. You have the Commission proposal, and the third leg in the EU discussions is the European Parliament. So the European Parliament conversations have been led by the two co-rapporteurs from IMCO and LIBE committees. And you might have seen a number of compromise texts and proposals over the last year and a half now. So we are now waiting for those two rapporteurs to kind of finalize their proposals. So all of them and voting, so all of them, all these three bodies can come up and come together with their positions, their approach, and start the trilogue process.
Yeah, so it's not straightforward. And so in terms of what so from what I know about the EU AI Act, I agree that, it really seems a lot more focused on harmonization, and allowing for AI products to move smoothly between companies and to countries rather. What, in terms of fundamental rights, what do you think is missing? So there's one lever on this, which is scope, like what falls into what risk category. Like that's one lever on sort of trying to protect people because the requirements are higher for a high risk category. And then another lever is what is required when you are in a particular category. So what in practice do you have? What are your obligations there? So and maybe there are more levers there, more details, but what's falling through the cracks here, or what's in danger of falling through the cracks?
There are a lot of exclusions, so as you know, Shea, the EU AI Act requires the providers of AI systems to kind of do the conformity assessment, which is a self-assessment to start with. So it's not independently verified or third-party verified. So you're just assessing your conformity, your risk levels against something which we don't know yet, because there aren't any standards or established criteria for this. And then the providers register themselves in the EU database to be put together, and they will say we are conforming to the regulation. So first and foremost, there isn't really any check mechanism, independent verification mechanism yet to do that, and the EU AI Act leaves space for that to come later.
Yeah.
But as is, there isn't anything for that. Second, the requirement is when it was initially drafted was only for private providers. There is now in the Council's general approach that they adopted, requirement for public authorities who are using these high-risk systems to register as well, which is a great addition, change to the regulation. So hope that goes through, but as is, that is something that is currently falling between the cracks, and something that we need to push forward. However, even if that goes through, the Council has carved out huge exclusions for those public entities to register. So anything in national security, military defense, law enforcement, and law enforcement is, if you actually go into the details, can cover a huge number of public entities. So law enforcement has exclusion, and then border control, asylum management, and immigration management. Those all have exclusions. Large IT scale systems, which sounds like IT systems, but it is really like the big databases that EU uses for immigration purposes, like Frontex, which has huge fundamental rights repercussions. Those are all excluded. So there's like a huge black hole exclusion category that needs to be sorted out. And then for us, especially at the center at CIDP, what we're also pushing for is some red lines. Some systems, some AI systems are fundamentally incompatible with fundamental rights, right? So you need to put some red lines, some prohibitions. The prohibitions needs to be expanded. And similarly, some pseudoscientific AI systems or practices like emotion recognition, biometric categorization, and predictive policing should be banned as well. So if we're talking about fundamental rights and rule of law, we shouldn't be legitimizing these systems with a legislation.
What do you think is the likelihood that, I mean, so they've already, so what's currently sort of prohibited under the current draft? Like, is there anything that's like hard prohibited currently? I think social scoring or something like that.
Social scoring is prohibited, and the council added private vendors or private providers of social scoring to the prohibition as well. I personally think that it is a very low-hanging fruit, because whenever you ask this question to policymakers, like, what do you actually mean by social scoring? The example is the China, the system, social scoring system that certain areas in China are piloting, which is an extensive system. I think that's a very low-hanging fruit, because no EU country would ever put that together. Anytime soon, or even in the long run. What we should be looking at is really scoring and risk profiling systems that have an impact on fundamental rights, and whether we should be doing, like, whether we should assess someone's trustworthiness or character or their political affiliation or religious affiliations, etc. So these are the systems that we should be discussing and possibly prohibiting, not social scoring, which is not defined anywhere in the and then let me get this right, real-time remote biometric identification systems for law enforcement purposes in public spaces is prohibited. And then if you look at, again, the exclusions, it looks like prohibition, but there are so many exclusions underneath that de facto it's not going to be a prohibition.
Like national security or other urgent interests of the state can override that. Is that the?
So national security, military, and defense are already excluded altogether.
For everything,
For everything. EU AI Act does not have any, like, they are not subject to EU AI Act to start with. In terms of the remote biometric identification systems for law enforcement, the exclusions there is how you're defining law enforcement and what kind of crimes are where you're allowed to use. And when you look at the list of crimes, it's anything from profiteering to money laundering to murder, arson, terrorism. So it's the whole spectrum. So we, again, it looks like prohibition, some sort of prohibition on paper. But then when you go down the rabbit hole and the details of all the references in that, it actually is not going to be that much of a prohibition. So we are pushing for a real, effective, meaningful prohibition on those as well.
Do you think there's a chance that this gets, I mean, is there a chance that they can get amended to be that? Like, what's the, I don't know the power dynamics in Europe in terms of who's pulling the strings during this process, but is there a chance that you can get something like this changed?
Well, if there wasn't a chance, we wouldn't be we wouldn't be doing this, right? So we really hope that at the end of the day that the European parliamentarians, Commission, Council really look back on the Charter and fundamental rights at the core of these, human dignity and fundamental rights and rule of law is the core of this. And we're also fighting against this misleading notion of innovation versus regulation.
The false dichotomy.
False dichotomy, exactly. So there are a number of organizations in EU who are also like fighting the same fight. So I hope that we can get more people to understand, one, regulation and innovation are not on the opposite sides. They actually complement each other, and regulations made for more creative, more innovative, and better products to start with. But also, we really need to be focusing on fundamental rights, because once these systems are in place, and as is, there are a lot of AI systems in place that are not regulated. Once the systems are in place, especially in the public sphere, it is almost impossible to kind of take them out or disentangle them from the infrastructure.
Yeah. So how do you think this so this overall approach compares to what's happening in the US now, which is still kind of, I mean, we have a roadmap for the AI Bill of Rights. There's not a Bill of Rights per se. And then there's a lot of work by individual regulators like the FTC trying to sort of come up with some strategy for protecting consumers or protecting Americans against AI that could go wrong. So what do you see are the sort of major differences? Is it going to be compatible? Is this going to be a problem in the future? Whatever your thoughts are on this.
A couple of things. One is there are existing stuff, as you mentioned, with FTC has enforcement authority on a number of stuff, and we have seen that already over the last couple of years with Weight Watchers, EverAlbum, and I want to say Meta as well, Epic Games. So we have seen a number of cases where whether it's like focused on privacy or actually algorithmic outcomes, etc., where the FTC has made some investigations and come, settled on with these companies. So it's not like there isn't anything. So that we need to be more focused on the FTC work and hopefully more strategic priority from the FTC side. Similarly, on EEOC and Consumer Protection Board, we need to have this as one of the strategic priority in their action plans, strategy plans for the next years. And there's definitely it's definitely moving in that direction if you listen to the individual agency discussions, right? You have the work of NIST that has been developing over the last 2 years now. Yeah, longer than that. So that is becoming like the tie-in point, one of the tying points between EU and US as well. So there is a lot of focus on the NIST work, and I think once NIST finalizes the standards and the framework, that will impact a lot of the US expectations and policy work. Yeah. Domestically, but also between EU and US as well in terms of alignment. So there's definitely work there. And then you have, like, as you mentioned at the beginning, you have the state and city level legislations that are coming up. California and Illinois are all have both have more comprehensive stuff. And I was just reading yesterday that ACLU has proposed as BIPA-like legislation to 10 states. So we might be seeing a similar Illinois BIPA-like legislations being pushed in those states as well.
Do you think is it like BIPA in the sense that there's going to be a private right of action as well? Because that was a lot of the action around that has been the ability for ordinary citizens to sort of.
It is my reading. Yeah, it is my reading. Exactly, the private right of action as well as the class action suits. where what is making BABL more, stronger
Yeah.
and stronger. So I would imagine that if you're pushing something like private right of action, has always needs to be there. I think we need to, like, to your point, we have the AI Bill of Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights as well, which needs to be implemented across different agencies. So there is a lot going, not to the EU level, but there is still a lot happening, and I think we need to celebrate that and push for implementation of those things. It is, however, hard to speak of congressional legislation, speed of congressional legislation, especially as today, as at the background there is like voting happening on.
They can't get a Speaker of the House. Yeah, that makes it difficult to get past anything. Well, I mean, I'll have to say, like, anecdotally, a lot of the sort of a lot of the activity in terms of private companies seeking help in things like either getting audits or risk assessments or help with AI governance. And I'm curious of what your experience is, has been driven more by the US activity than the European activity, in the sense that not many people are like, oh no, we got to get ready for the EU AI Act right now. It feels like they're more in a wait and see because they've experienced the long tail of the GDPR, but in the US things get passed really quickly, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got to do something about it, or there's some worry about the FTC or something. Have you experienced that, or do you think that the companies are starting to focus on the EU AI Act in terms of, like, what do we do about this?
I agree with you on the US side, but my experience so far on the EU side has been a lot of companies are seeing what is in the horizon.
Yeah.
And this act is not going anywhere. It might not end up being the exact same thing that is on the table right now, but it's not going anywhere, and it will eventually be a regulation. So a lot of the companies that I interact with are looking at the horizon and saying, hey, we need to do something about it. It's better to put these systems, capacities, as well as the systems and processes in place now. That would then need, like, small tweaks as the regulation becomes, or as the bill becomes law, rather than wait and see, and you're gonna hassle at the other end to comply with it. And I think, again, Shea, I think 100%, 110% sure that you're having the same conversations, that when I talk to companies, when I talk to clients, public and private, it's more about responsible and better innovation, and trying to avoid the conversations that are solely focused on compliance.
Yeah.
What the EU AI Act requires, what we're talking about, assessments, risk monitoring, having auditable trails in place, etc. These are all good business practices, right?
Yeah.
It's good for your products. It's good for your company's governance. It's good for your company's long-term sustainability and resiliency. So why wouldn't you already put this in place? So a lot of the conversations I'm having is focused on, there is a business case, and that business case is responsible AI, regardless of what the EU AI Act or FTC, etc. is doing. You want this for your company, you want this for your consumers, you want this for your employees. It just makes sense. So I think my experience on that is a bit different. The difference in the conversations is usually what to do immediately and what the roadmap looks like.
Yeah. What are the low-hanging fruit that you can? Yeah, there are definitely, like, a lot of common features among all the regulations. And as you mentioned, things like having documentation that can be audited, having risk management framework, doing risk assessments, monitoring things for bias and robustness, that having a governance structure that is non-trivial, that actually can govern your use of AI. Like, all of those things seem really those are going to be parts of some regulations or laws somewhere. And so, yeah, it does make a lot of sense. So I want to take a second because one of the hats that both of us wear is that we're both fellows at ForHumanity. And ForHumanity, for those listening who haven't encountered ForHumanity before, it's a nonprofit which focuses on sort of coming up with standards and criteria, basically translating laws and standards into auditable criteria. And so going back to the context of the EU AI Act, like what are your thoughts on how auditing or assurance plays a role in enforcing the requirements of the AI Act? Are people having this kind of conversation? Is it what are the kind of critical things that we need to focus on? If you had to check 5 things or whatever, what do we need to really focus on?
There's absolutely a lot of discussions about third-party verifications, certification schemes, independent audit schemes, etc. With a caveat or with an understanding that that ecosystem is not mature either in US or in Europe for that matter. So there is a hesitancy for the policymakers to require that right from the start, because if you don't have that ecosystem, and what in ForHumanity we call the ecosystem of trust, right? The whole infrastructure of what are the standards, how do you get certified, how do you ensure independency, how do you avoid conflict of interest, etc. Without those things, if you immediately mandate audits for all of the systems, there is, I think the hesitancy is coming from there, a race to the bottom. Of you might see a number of organizations mushrooming and saying putting certifications or labels saying this conforms, or like we audited, etc. Within the draft, there is there is acknowledgement of this ecosystem doesn't exist yet, but the regulation should look in its future iterations to mandate this, so or to require audits or third-party verification. So there is that piece already in the regulation, and I think it will be a matter of time rather than it will be a when rather than if. However, in the meantime, the regulation also, if you read the details, looks at standard setting bodies and implementation act. So what they're asking, or what is expected, is they will be asking standard setting bodies to come up with standards that would operationalize the legislation, like ForHumanity is working on, like Sensenelec is working on, or combination thereof. And then the commission would look at those proposals, and they might bless it as the standards that align with regulation. Or where it doesn't cover that, or they couldn't bless that, we're talking about an implementation act of the EU Act. So that will be yet another step for the EU Act, between that becoming law and between the effective date, there is another piece of how to implement this, how to operationalize this.
So, I mean, one of the things, so I've heard criticism about this approach coming from a number of people, and the criticism has focused on this idea of a conformity assessment, typically in the EU, focuses on having like a quality management system. And, internal, you have a quality management system, you document your quality management system, and then people come who do conformity assessments and look at your quality management system and say whether that's good or not. And I think people have been worried that there's a sort of it's divorced a little bit from necessarily what happens in practice. And so there's, a type of auditing where it's like, I'm looking at the documentation you gave me and saying, does that conform with what you should have? And then there's a type of auditing where I look at the documentation and then I go into your organization and I verify that in fact you're doing all of those things, and perhaps have some normative force where it's like what you did is actually not going to do what you say it's going to do, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on this, whether, to what extent should we as a community who knows what auditing looks like and kind of the, I hate to say importance of it, but I think what do we want to advocate for here? Like, do we think that that sort of having people keep their documents and you just review documents, or does it need to go deeper? Does there need to be some more visibility inside the companies?
My personal opinion is trust but verify.
Yeah.
That's what at the beginning when I was talking about, all this conformity assessments going into a database as it stands, you're trusting the companies to do the right thing. But we need verification, and that goes for audit, that goes for effective audits, that goes for true assessments, as well as right now where we are with the realities of the EU AI Act, the public database that this conformity assessments and technical documentation will be uploaded, that also needs to be publicly accessible for non-profit civil society organizations, interest groups to go in and actually verify as well. So I'm seeing this as a progressive thing, with the ultimate state as third-party independent audit mandated for high-risk AI systems, as is the case with financial audits.
Yeah.
So you don't go in, even with the mandates that we have some issues in the auditing space, due to conflict of interest, etc. And we have seen those some of the issues, experienced some of the issues in the past. So that verification, no conflict of interest, all those systems need to be in place. Then we just can't depend on individual assessments or just documentation without verification. But I think those are like progressive steps that you would need to have maturity. One of the things with the EU AI Act and this database, which I'm hoping that is going to be public fully, because it's still, if I'm reading the regulation correct, there is still not, it says it was going to be publicly accessible, but we'll see the extent of the documentation. So I think if we have access to that documentation in the meantime, as the whole ecosystem is maturing, we'll see how different companies are doing conformity assessments, what their approach has been, how do they approach risk, and how much transparency that they're providing, which will provide us with some like evolution and in terms of our thinking, possibly thinking out of the box, maybe with some good practices, so we can eventually reach to better best practices to create that audit system as well. So even with us, like even with the standard setting organizations, there's a best effort, and then there is industry influence, right?
Yeah.
So even with the best efforts, you might still not hit the target, because we still need to see some of these things in operation, some of these things in practice, to see that this is what we're thinking, but did it actually work?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like you were doing audits, right? You had a framework. I'm sure that you had to adapt certain things as you were actually doing them on the ground to the realities.
Yeah, things change. I mean, absolutely. I think what gets disclosed, what you can think of in the abstract as an ideal requirement that a company might do, or a disclosure that they might have, what becomes public and what doesn't become public. I think that evolves with the reality of how businesses are run and how AI works, and how what can and can't be shown. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, a big part of where the battle will be fought early on will be what does get disclosed publicly for these, whatever the risk management framework, quality frameworks, whatever these documentation these companies are and processes they're implementing. How public are they? And can we get researchers, can we get not just government be able to review it, or the regulators be able to review it, but can we get academics and civil society in there to scrutinize and say, you know what, this needs to be done slightly differently because we're seeing this pattern? Or so I think it is going to be critical at the early stages to get enough mandatory disclosures for the community to start coalescing around what, because if it's really minimal, like, yes, we looked at this and it looked fine, trust us, then that closes the door to a lot of scrutiny. And you can't always trust that the regulators are going to be equipped or have the capacity to also understand that, because most of the cutting edge stuff is happening in academia, happening in civil society in terms of research. And so I'm fascinated. I think there's going to be a ton of research projects where people are going to, like, it will happen with New York. I'm sure it'll happen with any laws that get passed that are actually forcing disclosures at the company level. In terms of how people are using AI, that's going to be really fruitful places for us to learn and adapt, because it's not going to be easy. It definitely is not going to be easy.
Absolutely, Shay. I mean, transparency is never an end in itself, but it is a must for accountability and proper governance. You cannot verify things, or you cannot keep organizations, public and private, accountable without that transparency. So the level of transparency, level of disclosures, and the detail, we need to get that right to make sure that the rest of the accountability process, and like the whole accountability process, actually works. And to your point, that cannot just sit with policymakers, it cannot sit with private companies and standard industry dominated standard setting bodies. It needs to be detailed and transparent enough for the rest of the society to input and shape as well.
So is this something that your organization is advocating for? Because I would imagine this connects really closely to fundamental rights, because one of the big worries is that lack of transparency. You don't know if your rights have been violated in a lot of cases. And so transparency does play a really big role in people having recourse to sort of protect those rights. And so is your organization advocating for these kind of things, like at that detailed level, or are you still just trying to be like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater? And like, at what level are you sort of pushing these recommendations? Are they at that detailed level, or is it still, you just aren't there yet?
110% we're pushing for detailed transparency and publicly accessible information. So at CIDP, we do this public involvement as well as transparency in a number of our initiatives. So the main one is AI and Democratic Values Index. You might be familiar with it. This is our annual publication. We're just putting finalizing the third edition, which is going to come out in a couple of months. With the AI and Democratic Values Index, we're now looking at 75 countries, their national AI strategies, their commitments, and then practices on the ground. So this is solely public actor practices.
Yeah.
So for example, in your national AI strategy, you might be saying, we were going to be like, we're going to have AI systems and AI strategy that is fair, respects equality, fairness. We commit to OECD AI principles, etc. And then you turn around and you're putting massive surveillance systems or predictive policing or other stuff as part of your public infrastructure practices. Then there is a big gap, right? So with the index, we're looking at each of these countries' commitment versus commitment to OECD AI principles, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what they have in the national AI strategies, and then UNESCO recommendations. Have they committed to this? What are they doing on the ground? And then making that gap transparent through the index. The second piece is our what we call public voice. So we are proactively, our whole network is proactively scanning public consultation and public voice opportunities around the world. And we publish that on our public voice page with the idea that regardless of what your stand is, it might not always align with CIDPs, but regardless of what your stand is, we need more involvement, we need more inclusive discussion. So we try to publicize those opportunities so that they're amplified, more people get to comment on this public consultation periods.
That's a great service.
And then on the other end, for some of those, CIDP actually puts out its own position papers, recommendations, and statement under our statements. So where we feel very strongly as it relates to fundamental rights, democratic values, and rule of law, we will put together our own recommendations. We don't do that for every opportunity that we amplify, but for as we see, as we have capacity and as we see the importance of it, we will also put that in place, submit that to the authorities, work actually directly with some of these organizations like Council of Europe, LIBE or IMCO committees, national governments themselves, etc., and kind of make public consultation how do you say, a must-have in the process. And then finally, in terms of our recommendations to all governments, and these recommendations are coming both from our research as well as the AI and Democratic Values Index itself. We ask the governments to be more transparent, fair, and accountable in their public procurement process as well. So it's not always the vendor that we should put the focus on. We also need similar focus on the public actors and what they bring into the public infrastructure.
Yeah, procurement will definitely be it's starting to become a big lever for some of these practices. Like we've seen a lot of people seeking help because whoever their client is going to be is requiring a higher standard for responsible AI. I want to remind people we're getting a little late on time here, but if you have questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. So I want to switch gears slightly here as the kind of the final thing, and get some free consulting from you. Let's say there's a small organization, like a small organization that uses AI or develops AI, and they are starting from ground zero, right? They're a startup or they're a small organization, and they want to do the right thing. They want to focus on responsible AI. What would be your advice for where's the beginning part of this journey? Like what are the first things you should start doing to sort of get the ball rolling, so to speak, that's the highest sort of ROI, so to speak, for responsible AI?
I would say at both C-level, board level, and further down operational level, building capacity. Don't jump into anything without understanding what it is and what you need to do and how that impacts your organization. Because you can do small changes in your, for example, product development cycles, in your agile process, etc. But those are like one-off. You really need to understand what is it that we're talking about in responsible AI? What does governance look like? What are these principles that everyone is talking about in different ways? Everyone is shaping it differently, but what is it actually? What would it entail? What does human rights impact mean? How do you assess this stuff, etc.? So get that understanding first. So I would say building that capacity and that basic foundational understanding is the first step, so that you can look at the horizon saying, okay, these are our organization's mission, and this is our values, this is our corporate culture, these are our products and services. What are the big impact points? Where do we start? What's the starting point, how that roadmap evolves, maturity evolves over time, etc. It's really hard to have those conversations about roadmap and maturity without having that that foundational understanding first.
So education, and so you think going out and just finding a place where you can get that foundational sort of capacity, like what are we even talking about here? And so are there resources, like where would you go for that?
There are a number of, and I'm not talking about technical capacity, right? So I'm not asking everyone to learn how to code or do statistical analysis, but at least understand the foundational concepts and how they relate to each other. There are a number of online courses that one can look at. There's a number of papers and tools, like open source tools that you can utilize. That was one of the reasons that I put together aiethicist.org in the first place. If you go to the website, I'm now at something like 900 plus resources.
Okay.
In terms of research, reports, open access tools, etc. So in terms of getting that foundational understanding and kind of keeping up on where the latest conversation is, I definitely suggest kind of reading through those. And then if obviously companies like mine, and I talk about capacity building training, right? So I do a lot of training tailored to the organization, not just how do you say, generic. This is responsible AI stuff. That is legit. That is definitely legit for that foundational conversation. But if you want something that is more tailored to your organization, there are a number of us providing that capacity building training, etc. as well.
And you think, so if I read into what you had said earlier, once that capacity is built, it sounds like you're advocating for kind of like, how does it align with your principles, like contextualizing what you're figuring out, what your organization stands for, what is going to be appropriate. Is that the next level? Like, let's say now I have an awareness that algorithms can violate rights. They can be biased, and we're using algorithms, and the way we develop them might be important. Then you think that next step is like saying, okay, what do we stand for? What are our principles? What are our red lines? That sort of thing.
It is. And if you have done anything about change management or organizational behavior management, you know that you can't just push things from the top and change all like processes and approaches at once. So once you have that capacity across the organization, or at least in the key areas with key personnel, that you can then look at, as you mentioned, as you summarized, what is the most impactful area for us to start? Where can we pilot some of this stuff? Where can we make this approach, process changes, procedure changes more mature, and then build upon that block by block. It's not going to work if you push something from like, okay, the CEO says we need to change this, and then this like massive overhaul, it's not sustainable.
It's got to be a cultural change then. It's got to be
Cultural
some,
change, yeah.
and that needs
Exactly.
capacity or people being aligned. Okay, well, I think this is Merve gave us some really good, free consulting and food for thought. So if you're a small organization thinking about this, it's aiethicist.org, and they can go. There's some resources there. Is that the right? Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So let me check. So I think we don't have any questions. Thank you so much for your time. I think this has been very exciting. I'm excited to hear somebody else talk besides myself. So that's been great. And
I'll do the babbling.
Yeah. You've contributed to the babbling now, and that's but as always, like super clear, super insightful. I'm excited for the future. I think that this is, there's so much momentum now towards regulation that is going to meaningfully protect fundamental rights. And I think that a lot of the hard work is starting now. Like we have to figure out what are the mechanisms that are actually going to do it. And it sounds like you're sort of at the forefront there. And thank you so much for sharing your time.
Of course, Shay. Always a pleasure to talk to you and brainstorm, discuss. Really appreciate the time.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone else for showing up. And as always, feel free. This will be on YouTube and a podcast, and feel free to comment there if you'd like. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.